The chill of February lingered, sharp and unyielding, as I stepped onto the porch that morning. The world was still painted in hues of frost and gray, the trees bare and skeletal against the pale sky. My breath fogged in the air as I bent to retrieve the small bundle of mail at my feet, a mundane assortment of advertisements and bills. But nestled among them was an envelope that seemed distinctly wrong. It was the color that caught my eye first, a deep crimson, almost wet-looking, as if it had been dipped in fresh paint. The paper glistened faintly in the weak sunlight, and though it bore no stamps or addresses, my name was scrawled across it in looping, ornate script. My pulse quickened as I turned it over in my hands. The wax seal holding it shut was intricate, depicting a heart split by an arrow. Something about the craftsmanship felt unnervingly deliberate, as if someone had poured great care into creating it just for me. For a moment, I considered tossing it away. There was no return address, no indication of who had sent it, and the festive shade seemed garish against the dull winter backdrop. But curiosity is a cruel master, and it gnawed at me relentlessly. I slipped my finger beneath the seal, the wax breaking with a faint, reluctant pop. The card inside was heavier than I expected, its texture oddly smooth and cool, like polished bone. The front bore a simple, delicate design of blooming roses, their petals rendered in ink so black they seemed to drink the light. But it was the message inside that froze me in place. To the one who thinks they've known love, prepare for its unmaking, prepare for your undoing. The words were written in the same looping script, every letter sharp and elegant, as though etched with intention. The handwriting seemed to whisper across my skin, cold and familiar in a way I couldn't quite name. At the bottom of the card was a date and time. Today, 6:45 p.m. I stared at the card, the weight of its words pressing down on me like a tangible thing. There was no sender, no explanation, only that ominous directive. The creeping dread was subtle at first, a faint unease like the soft hum of an unseen fly. But as the minutes stretched into hours, it grew sharper, twisting into something gnawing and insistent. Who had sent this? And why? The day passed in a blur of restless pacing and half-hearted attempts to distract myself. By the time the appointed hour approached, the weight of the card felt like an anchor tied to my chest. As I stood in the gathering dusk, watching the clock inch closer to 6:45, I realized I wasn't just dreading what would come. I was waiting for it. And in that moment, as the first chime of the hour sounded, I knew my life had been pulled into a rhythm not my own. The card's message had not changed, or so I thought. But as the hours ticked by, something about it seemed subtly different. The ink shimmered faintly in the dim light of my desk lamp, and the ornate letters seemed to ripple, as though caught in the rhythm of a heartbeat. Was it my imagination, or had the handwriting become even more precise, more malevolent, with each glance? Unable to sit still, I turned to the one place I'd always gone in times of confusion, the local library. I combed through shelves of books on symbolism, folklore, and Valentine's traditions, but none held any answers. It wasn't until a librarian, a gaunt man with hollow cheeks and a soft, rasping voice, overheard my frustrated muttering that I found a clue. "You might try visiting the Calligraphers Guild downtown," he said, his pale eyes glinting behind thick glasses. "They specialize in unusual texts. They might know something about your card." The thought of sharing the strange artifact with anyone else filled me with a nameless dread. But I nodded, clutching the card tightly as if afraid it might disappear. The guild was housed in an unassuming building, its facade weathered and cracked, with a faded sign hanging above the door. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ink and parchment. Shelves of ancient tools and scrolls lined the walls, and the faint scratching of a quill echoed from the far corner. A woman, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, looked up from her work as I entered. "You have something for me?" she asked, her voice as sharp as the blade of a penknife. Wordlessly, I handed her the card. She examined it without a word, her thin fingers tracing the edges of the paper with a reverence that made my skin crawl. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost reverent. "This is no ordinary card," she said, setting it down carefully. "The ink is alchemical. It shifts to match the heart of the reader. And the script, it's ancient, a style once used in rituals to bind fate." "What kind of fate?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Her eyes bore into mine, cold and knowing. "A binding of the soul. Whoever sent this card to you wields a power both rare and dangerous. This is not a love letter. It's a warning." I tried to protest, to demand an explanation, but she silenced me with a raised hand. "You must understand, the card will demand something of you before the night is through. And whether you give it or not, the choice will not feel like your own." Her words settled over me like frost, chilling and unyielding. As I left the guild, the card seemed heavier in my pocket, its faint pulse now perfectly in sync with my own. The card grew heavier with each passing hour. No matter where I placed it, on the counter, in a drawer, even beneath a stack of books, I could still feel it. Its presence pulsed faintly in the air, as if demanding to be noticed. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't resist anymore. I retrieved it from its hiding place and flipped it open. The message had changed. "Do you remember the first time your heart broke?" The words struck like a cold wind, sharp and unexpected. My hands trembled as I stared at the page, the ink shimmering faintly. The question was more than rhetorical. It felt like a command, pulling me toward memories I'd long buried. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, heavier, as the card's words took root. And then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made my breath catch. Evelyn. I hadn't spoken to her in years, not since our relationship ended in a haze of resentment and regret. Yet here she was, calling me on this of all days. I hesitated before answering, my voice unsteady. "Hello?" Her tone was as I remembered, soft but guarded. "I don't know why I'm calling. I just felt like I needed to." There was a long pause, then, "Are you okay?" The question lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken meanings. I wanted to dismiss it, to tell her everything was fine, but the truth bubbled up unbidden. Something strange is happening. I don't know how to explain it." For a moment, there was only the sound of her breathing. Then, with a hesitance that made my stomach twist, she said, "Maybe we should talk, in person." We agreed to meet at the park where we used to spend lazy Sunday afternoons, a place I hadn't visited since the day we broke up. As I approached the familiar bench beneath the sprawling oak tree, a wave of unease washed over me. The park felt different, emptier, quieter, as if the world itself had thinned. Evelyn was waiting, her face a mixture of nostalgia and uncertainty. "You look the same," she said, her voice tentative. "You don't," I replied, surprising myself with the honesty. She looked older, though not in a physical sense. It was in her eyes, the way they seemed weighed down by invisible burdens. We talked for hours, circling the pain we'd caused each other, the misunderstandings that had spiraled out of control. As we spoke, the card sat heavy in my pocket, a silent observer. Its presence seemed to thrum with satisfaction, as if it had orchestrated this meeting, pulling at the strings of our lives like a puppeteer. But as the conversation wound down, a strange sensation prickled at the edges of my awareness. The shadows beneath the trees seemed to stretch unnaturally, creeping closer with each passing moment. I blinked, convinced it was a trick of the fading light, but the sensation remained. Evelyn must have noticed my distraction. "What's wrong?" I shook my head, forcing a smile. Nothing, just tired. We said our goodbyes, and as I walked away, I glanced back to see her standing beneath the oak tree, her silhouette outlined by the last rays of sunlight. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw another figure standing beside her, a tall, dark shape that melted into the shadows as quickly as it appeared. Night had fallen by the time I returned home, and the card seemed to hum with anticipation as I pulled it from my pocket. This time the message was shorter, but no less chilling. "You've opened the door. Now walk through it." The words felt like a command, reverberating in my mind long after I'd read them. I set the card down on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water, trying to steady my nerves. But as I stared out the window into the darkened street, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood at the far end of the street, motionless beneath the faint glow of a street lamp. It was too far away to make out details, but its presence was undeniable. It wasn't a person waiting for a bus or walking a dog. It was something else, something that felt deeply, unnervingly wrong. I turned away, my heart pounding, and reached for my phone to call Evelyn. But as I unlocked the screen, the card's message flickered across the display, the words etched in the same looping script. "Don't look away." My stomach twisted as I slowly turned back to the window. The figure was closer now, standing just outside the circle of light from the nearest lamp. Its form was blurred, as though it were not entirely part of this world. The air around it shimmered faintly, distorting like heat waves. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe as it took a step forward. And then another. With each step, the streetlight nearest to it flickered and dimmed, the darkness inching closer to my house. My mind raced, but I was frozen, caught between the instinct to flee and the paralyzing grip of fear. The clock on the wall chimed softly, marking the hour. Midnight. As the final chime faded, the figure stopped, its gaze fixed on my window. Though it had no discernible features, I could feel its attention, its awareness, bearing down on me like a physical weight. The card on the counter seemed to pulse faintly, its presence a lifeline and a threat all at once. I don't remember moving, but somehow I ended up back in my living room, the card clutched tightly in my hand. The figure hadn't followed me inside, but its presence lingered, a heavy shadow pressing against the edges of my consciousness. The message on the card had changed again, the ink dark and final. "Tomorrow, it will end. Be ready." I dropped the card as if it had burned me, its weight suddenly unbearable. The night stretched on, filled with whispers I couldn't hear and shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Sleep didn't come, and when the first light of dawn broke through the window, it brought no comfort. Tomorrow was here, and so was the end. Dawn seeped reluctantly into the sky, the light pale and hesitant, as if even the sun feared to intrude on what the day would bring. The card sat untouched on the table, its presence a quiet challenge. I stared at it for what felt like hours, its final message echoing in my mind. Tomorrow, it will end. Be ready. What did it mean? How could I prepare for something I didn't understand? The figure from last night haunted my thoughts, its featureless face, and the oppressive weight of its presence burned into my memory. As the hours dragged by, the world outside grew eerily still. The faint hum of traffic was absent, the usual chatter of birds silenced. Even the wind had ceased, leaving the air heavy and stagnant. It was as if the world itself had paused, holding its breath for whatever was coming. At exactly noon, the card shimmered faintly, drawing my gaze despite my resolve to ignore it. The words had changed once more. Go to where it all began. The park, the oak tree, the place where Evelyn and I had spoken, where the first tendrils of the card's influence had tightened around my life. I hesitated, fear clawing at my resolve, but the pull was undeniable. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and the streets were deserted. Each step toward the park felt heavier, as if the earth itself resisted my progress. The park was empty, its usual charm erased by the oppressive silence. The oak tree loomed ahead, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal hands. Beneath it stood Evelyn, her figure small and frail against the vastness of the tree. She held something in her hands, a small box wrapped in the same crimson paper as the envelope that had started this nightmare. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice soft but steady. I approached slowly, my heart pounding. "What is this, Evelyn? What's happening?" She looked at me with a sadness that made my stomach twist. "I don't know. I found this on my doorstep this morning. It had your name on it." She extended the box, and I took it reluctantly. It was light, almost weightless, but the moment it touched my hands, I felt a faint warmth emanating from within. My fingers hesitated at the edge of the paper. "Open it," she urged. With a deep breath, I peeled away the wrapping. Inside was a single rose, its petals a deep, otherworldly black. It seemed alive, the edges of its petals shimmering faintly, as if catching a light that wasn't there. Beneath it was a note, written in the same ornate script as the card. "Only one will walk away. Choose." A chill ran through me as the words settled in my mind. "What does this mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. Evelyn shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know. I've been drawn here just like you." The rose seemed to pulse faintly in my hands, its presence growing heavier by the second. And then, without warning, a familiar figure stepped from the shadows. It was the thing from the street lamp, its shape blurred and wrong, its gaze, or what I felt as a gaze, fixed on us. The air grew colder, and the shadows beneath the oak tree deepened, swallowing the light. The figure didn't speak, but its presence was commanding. The rose in my hands seemed to shift, its stem curling slightly as if in response. "What do you want from us?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure raised a hand, pointing first at me, then at Evelyn. It was a silent command, but its meaning was clear. The choice was mine. The weight of the decision crushed me. If the card's prophecy was true, then my choice would seal not just my fate, but hers as well. I looked at Evelyn, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes steady. "Take it," she said softly. "Whatever this is, it was meant for you." Tears blurred my vision as I extended the rose toward her. "Number, I can't." The rose glowed faintly, its petals darkening further, and I felt an almost imperceptible pull. It wasn't a matter of choice anymore. It was inevitable, a thread that had been spun long before either of us realized. I turned to the figure, the rose still in my hand, and met its gaze. The weight of its presence lessened, replaced by a strange calm. The figure stepped back into the shadows, and as it disappeared, the rose crumbled into ash, scattering in the cold wind. Evelyn and I stood in silence beneath the oak tree, the world around us slowly returning to life. The sun broke through the clouds, its light weak but comforting. "It's over," she said, though her voice held no conviction. But as I looked at her, then at the faint scorch mark where the rose had fallen, I couldn't shake the feeling that the card's promise had yet to be fulfilled. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed,